Okay, class, good afternoon. And this is lecture 4. And we are more or less completing the basis of what we've been mentioning with respect to text, texture, and architecture. And today we'll be taking a look at a specific example and going through the analysis of it. And I hope that that will be helpful, as that will be more of what you will be doing going forward, looking at a text and actually actually analyzing it. Today, just briefly mentioned the kinds of things I do want you to be sort of aware of, and the kinds of okay, the words that I'd like you to, the vocabulary that I'd like you to be very much aware of as we go forward. We've been talking about texture, and that we said it has to do with cohesion. And Halliday, as I've been mentioning, more or less looks at cohesion in terms of what he calls inter-sentence texture. Those are the things that we've been mentioning: reference, lexical cohesion, substitution, ellipsis, conjunction, and so forth. And those are what we would call inter-sentence textures. So across the text, in between the various clauses that make up the text, there's a cohesiveness with respect to these various aspects. But there's another which he mentions, and that's what he calls intra-sentence texture. So that intra-sentence texture refers back then to the choices that you make within a clause, and that's why it's intra-sentence. The choice you make about theme, how you begin that clause, and how you express the flow of information given to new, and so forth. So these two aspects of the cohesiveness of the text, the inter-sentence texture, what we've been mentioning with respect to the choice of theme, how you begin a particular clause, the flow of information, old information, new information, intra-sentence texture. A text has a particular texture, and from that texture, another way I like to look at it is a kind of patterning, all right? Beyond that, though, there is within a particular text, there seems to be a structure. And that is something we've called its architecture, its rhetorical structure. And on this basis, we've been looking at it from the standpoint of the work done by William Mann, Sandra Thompson, Christian Matheson, all right? And their work with rhetorical structure theory. So these are sort of the basics of what we've been looking at, all right? Summary of main points: cohesiveness, coherence are essential properties of the text. They're not the same. So when we talk about coherence, what I like to do is sort of apply it to the rhetorical structure, the logical structure of the text as a whole. Textual meaning realized by thematic and information structures. And this is related to that intra-sentence texture. Thematic structure contributes to a text texture, its cohesiveness, and architecture. Right, so the way you apply, now how does that happen? Well, remember we identified continuous thematic progression. What was that? That's where you have the same thing repeated as theme. Well, that gives a sort of a continuity. That also contributes to the cohesiveness of the text. You have a linear thematic progression, the flow of information. How you ended one clause is how you begin the next. We call that linear thematic progression. It relates to the flow of information. All of this then comes across then also through the architecture of the text. And what is the architecture? It's realized as a hierarchical organization of the spans of text, from the clause at the bottom, the clauses, the constituent clauses that make up the text at the bottom, all the way up to the text as a whole at the top. And each of these sort of spans, we call them functionally significant spans, each of them is logically related. The pairs are logically related. All right, so now I did give you this text and I asked you to print it out because it would be more useful for you to have the text sort of in hand. But I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to go through it sort of step by step. And as I do so, is try to illustrate certain points with respect to the analysis. Now, the text is obviously an abstract. It's an abstract from a journal article. All right, so, and it's in linguistics. And so let's take the first sentence. Now, the way I do the tagging is like this. And as you can see here, I have clause. Okay, so within these angle brackets, I'm going to indicate each clause, and I'm going to give it a number. And so the number would be, for example, the sentence. So this is clause 1A. 1A, now notice though, there's something quite interesting here, and that is that we just don't have clauses that necessarily are in sequence. Some clauses are embedded within other clauses, and that's illustrated with this sentence here. Let me read it. Urbanchik extends previous ideas. Now we have a new clause regarding the enhancement of contrast between phonological segments to the enhancement of contrast between duplemes. All right. Now, we don't really need to understand the text so much, as we are just basically at this point analyzing it. Now, what I've put within square brackets is what I would call an embedded clause. This embedded clause is post-modifying the noun, ideas, okay? So ideas is, it's a noun, and then we have a clause that gives sort of a post-modification of that. Previous ideas regarding the enhancement of contrast between phonological segments, those ideas are modified by this clause. So the clause itself is functioning as part of the noun phrase. The head noun is ideas, and the post-modification is clause 1B. So if you see, now how can you tell? Well, you ask yourself, for example, here, this clause regarding. Now, why is it a clause? Because of course you have a verb, regarding. Okay? Now that's a clause. Whenever you see a verb, you have a clause. But if that clause seems to be post-modifying a noun, describing a previous noun, that clause has most likely been embedded. And the way we describe it is we say it's been rank shifted. It's now no longer really functioning like a clause. It's functioning like part of a noun phrase. It's a modifier of a head noun. And in that regard, then the clause has been sort of downranked to a phrase, to the level of phrase. So in this first sentence, we really have one clause. That clause has the verb extends. Now, what I've highlighted in red here is theme. All right, so as we're going through it, we're going to be doing three things here. We're going to be identifying the clauses that make up the text. We're going to sort of tag them with these tags like in angle brackets here, 1A, 1B, and so forth. We will indicate where there are embedded or rank-shifted clauses. And we're going to identify the verb in the main clauses, all right? I'm not going to bother with those verbs that are in the embedded or rank-shifted clause. All right, so Urbanchik, 2005, that's theme. Extends, that's the verb. Previous ideas, and then all that regarding such and such and such extends to the enhancement. Well, that's still modifying extends to the enhancement. It's a prepositional phrase. So it's all part of one clause. All right, what about the second sentence? The second sentence, You say you don't have square brackets marking the clauses. You should have. This is in the version that I uploaded. In any case, for now, pay attention more or less to the screen, what I'm looking at here, all right? Be looking at this as we go through it. Second sentence, Urbanchik is again theme. Now, what do you notice about this? Urbanchik, Urbanchik. By now, you should be thinking about theme and the kind of thematic progression. Continuous, right? Urbanchik, Urbanchik. Well, what is the first two sentences? They're sort of, they are connected to each other. There is a sense of cohesiveness to it. There's a continuity to the idea of what we're talking about. Urbanchik. What was this? Whoever was writing this paper was beginning by sort of that, looking at the literature and identifying someone that they're going to be sort of discussing their findings with respect to Urbanchiks, all right? Second sentence, Urbanchik shows. That's the main verb. 2A, that's one clause. Now 2B, we have another clause. It begins with that. That is, in a way, it's indicating what we've called, if you remember when we talked about the kinds of verbs, we talked about something called projection, all right? We said that verbs that deal with expressing something, verbal or mental, those project, and they take a that clause. That here is a conjunction. That in various, now it begins a new clause, 2B. This is a that clause, we call it, in various Salish and Austronesian languages. Now I've highlighted this as theme, right? Now, as theme then, what is that? What kind of theme is that? Remember, we said that its theme would be the first experiential element. Well, in various Salish and Austronesian languages, that describes where, right? That's the circumstance. And so you put the circumstance theme as theme, not the subject. What's the subject of this sentence? The subject of this sentence is reduplicants of identical shape. Reduplicants of identical shape, that's the subject, but it's not theme. Instead, you've put the circumstances theme, where? In various Salish and Austronesian languages. All right, so that is theme, not the subject. You put this, usually, yes, in a statement, the subject would be, the grammatical subject would be theme. That's sort of by default, right? But in this case, you put the circumstances theme. In fact, we would say that in a way it's somewhat marked. By marked, I mean it's a bit not the usual. It's not the expected, it's not the grammatical subject. You put something else first. It's a choice you've made. And so 2B is a that clause. It has a conjunction that. We could say that that, in fact, is the textual theme. In various Salish and Austronesian languages is the ideational theme. It's the circumstances theme. Now, I've put together the modality and the verb here, can have. So 2B, can have, all right? That is the verb plus a modal can in 2B. 2C is also a clause. I should have highlighted the verb depend. Just a moment. Depending is also a verb. Now, it's not a, now the verb here shows. We would say that that carries primary tense. We would call that the finite verb. Can have, all right? Again, it's the finite verb, but the tense would be expressed on the modal auxiliary. But here on 2C, there is no expression of primary tense. It's an ing verb. So it's a non-finite verb, we would call it. And in this case, then 2C, it's a clause. It's a non-finite verb clause, depending ing verb. Now, normally, when it's a non-finite clause, we do not look for theme. We only look for theme, only identify theme in finite verb clauses. Okay? That's one of the points to mention here. All right, so as we're going through this, okay, I'm just looking at the chat and so forth. Someone mentioned that the screen sometimes looks blurry. That shouldn't be. I'm also, as I mentioned to you last week, I'm also looking at on another computer, and that does seem to be all right. Do many of you have trouble with looking at the screen? Anybody, any other? Is it okay? All right. So it seems our connections, it could be mine, it could be yours. That's why I set it up on another computer so that I can sort of monitor to see if it's coming out, at least being broadcast. But again, it'll depend. All right. So some of you say sometimes blurry. Some of you say it's okay. Let's keep going. Are you following okay what I've been talking about? The idea of identifying clauses. How do we do so? They have a verb. Can be a finite verb, can be a non-finite verb. How do you recognize theme? Well, that we've discussed before. That's what occurs initially. It can be an ideational theme, or it could be a textual theme. All right, let's keep going. Clause 3. Oh, you mentioned 2C. No, it doesn't necessarily mean that every verb that follows, because the depending, this depending in 2C describes what? It describes when they will have this different surface realization. In a way, it is sort of a process that is modifying the previous process. Whether or not it's going to have a different surface realization depends on the morphological function. So the depending here, 2C, is not an embedded clause. It's not modifying realizations. It's modifying when they will have it. It is describing sort of the circumstances under which there would be different surface realizations. It's not modifying realizations. It's modifying the verb that occurred earlier. All right? So it's not an embedded clause. Okay, going on to 3. Yes, there's a difference. Someone says a dependent clause. Yes, definitely. Non-finite clauses are all dependent. But keep in mind, we have independent, dependent. That describes a relationship that would be hypotactic. Now, those are connections between clauses. But when we've talked about what goes into what is a post-modifier of a noun or a nominalization, which we'll see in a moment, when we put it in square brackets like that, we're saying that it's embedded. That's a different thing altogether. That's not parataxis. It's not hypotaxis. It's not even saying that you have two clauses that are connecting. It's saying that you have, when it's rank shifted, you're saying that that clause now isn't functioning like a clause. In fact, it was buried within a noun phrase, post-modifying a noun. Well, that's one different, major difference, all right? So you have clauses joined, whether paratactically or hypotactically. If you have a non-finite clause, just go back to this, like in 2C, yes, it is hypotactic, all right? 2B is hypotactic with 2A. That clause cannot stand alone. All right, so the main clause here is Urbanchik. To be is just as equal a clause, but it is a dependent clause, a relationship. When you say whether it's dependent or independent, that's describing a relationship between clauses. We keep going. 3. 3 is simple. There's only one verb. Very clearly, we have a for example at the beginning theme. So for example would be sort of a textual theme. And then the grammatical subject, which is the name of some Austronesian language. That's the ideational theme. 3 is easy. Okay, let's go on to 4. All right, 4. Again, the one thing now, one of the steps that I'd recommend to you when you're going through your analysis and so forth is when you come across a sentence, highlight the verbs. Highlight the verbs. All right, so 4, whereas the distributive requires, then you have 4b, the diminutive requires. The whereas, what is the whereas? What's the function of whereas? Textual. Whereas you have, on the one hand, the distributive requires this. 4b, the diminutive requires that. So you have 2 clauses that are related to each other. All right? Whereas this, the other 4b this. All right, so it's quite straightforward. Again, 5. Urbanchik's claim is. Now, here's an interesting thing. It's a bit different than what I've mentioned. I again have square brackets. Again, though, it's not modifying a noun. So what is this? Well, when you have Urbanchik's claim is, well, what follows it in 5b is in fact filling in the space that would normally be occupied by a noun phrase. It's a noun. What is Urbanchik's claim? That this stress shift functionally serves to differentiate the 2 duplemes. What we call that is a nominalization. You've taken a clause, you've turned it into essentially a nominalization. It is a clause, it has all the elements of a clause, but you've turned it into something which behaves now like a noun, fills the slot where you would expect a noun to be, following the verb to be. Something which identifies what is Urbanchik's claim. In this sense, this identified, the identifier of Urbanchik's claim, again, we'll put it in square brackets. It's a nominalization. What I hope you begin to see is what we put in square brackets, what we say is embedded, or, and I like the phrase rank shifted even better. Because what has happened here is it's taken a clause, 5b, and what it's done is it's put it into basically what essentially is a noun phrase. Now, how could you have said 5a differently? Could you have said 5a differently? You could have said Urbanchik claims that this stress shift, right? And if you had done that, it would be a different story altogether. Then claim would be a verb. It would be projecting of that clause. But you didn't put it that way. Instead, what you did was you put Urbanchik's claim, you created that noun phrase, you used the verb to be as almost like an equal sign, and followed it by another. Now here was a clause that basically functions as the object of what is the verb to be. Okay, I have to apologize. Sometimes you will hear some drilling, all right? There is some construction noise that has going on. It comes on and off and so forth. I hope that it doesn't disturb us too much, and I expect they will probably be going for lunch soon. All right, it's not in my place, it's in uh, another place, so sorry about that, though. I hope it doesn't disturb you too much. All right, so yes, is it a kind of nominalization? Yes. Are we going all right so far? All right, so continue. 5B is a rank shifted clause. 5A is the main clause, followed by now 5C. If is textual theme. I've highlighted in blue. There is the subject, all right? There expresses a kind of, we call the existential there, all right? It's not like here and there, it's there is and there the verb to be. Okay, 5C, if there was no difference in stress. 5D, then. Okay, sorry, one more correction I need to make here. 5D, this is theme. Let me correct that right here. Okay, if there was no difference in stress, 5D, then, and then the resulting surface forms, theme, would be, that's the predicate. Again, it's the verb to be combined with the modal auxiliary would. Homophonous and therefore ambiguous. 5C, 5D, that's rather straightforward. If, then, both textual themes. There, the existential there is grammatical subject. 5D, the resulting surface forms. All right, theme. 6, in this paper. All right, in this paper, that's theme. Again, it's the circumstances theme, not we. You pushed we out of the theme position. In fact, we usually call, when you have that grammatical subject that's been sort of pushed aside and something else has filled its place, like the circumstance, we call that the displaced theme. All right, it isn't theme anymore. But you've chosen instead to put in this paper. We provide additional examples. And what about those examples? Well, how would you describe them? That support Urbanchik's general thesis. So again, 6B, modifying examples. Think of it like this. The that here, you could just as well put a WH pronoun, which support Urbanchik's general thesis. Basically a relative clause. And that relative clause is modifying examples. And what kind of examples? The examples that support Urbanchik's general thesis. You're limiting which examples are we talking about. And so therefore it's also an embedded clause. Again, it's a rank shifted clause. And again, I'm not highlighting the verb here in the dependent or embedded clauses. 7A. All right. There's a question here in 6B is not display theme. Not display theme. Let me just let's see, where's my chat? It's displaced theme, all right? Not display theme, all right? And 6B is nominalization, since it is working like a supposed noun phrase. 6B is functioning like a relative clause. 6B, it is a relative clause. It is a defining relative clause. Instead of that, you could just as well use which, all right? So in that case, it is the relative clause is part of the noun phrase, examples. It is post-modifying examples. All right? Let me put this aside. 7. Let's go on to 7. For example, again, using textual theme. Now, these are going to all be useful. These textual themes will be so useful later on when we are going to come back to this. And we're going to be looking at it from the standpoint of how are these clauses all connected? What's the sort of architecture of the text? Every time you put in one of these sort of textual themes, what you're doing is you're signaling to the reader what those relationships are. For example, obviously, you're elaborating, all right? You're saying we provide additional examples, and then you give an example of that. So 7 is obviously going to be elaborating on what you just said in 6. What examples? For example. And then you give in another, okay. Now notice that what's important here is probably not so much, it's always sort of setting the context. In which languages are we talking about? And so we notice that occurs as theme quite a bit here. So here again, it's the circumstances theme. The grammatical subject, a reduplicant, representing iterative. The 7b, again, is post-modifying reduplicant. Now, you might say there seems to be a lot of embedding here. There seems to be a lot of nominalization. There seems to be a lot of post-modification of nouns. Yes, because this kind of writing is this. It's academic writing. In academic writing, we put everything into sort of, you turn happenings into some things. You turn them into nouns. A lot of nominalization. And so in academic writing, you begin to see there's a lot of embedding because you pack all this information in a reduplicant. What about this reduplicant? Representing, which is representing iterative. Again, it's like a relative clause, modifying reduplicant. So 7b is also an embedded clause. When we talk, we don't normally do a lot of that kind of thing. When we actually talk and write in less formal or like academic writing, we tend to just have clauses that connect one to the other. We don't do a lot of embedding. That embedding is something which occurs because in writing you have time to sort of think about how you're going to express it. And you try to be more concise, and you try to pack more information in. So you turn those clauses as part of a modification of some noun. Okay, forms is the predicate. 7c, but, again, textual theme. And again, I make the point here, those textual themes are signals to us, the relationships between 7c and what came before it. The denotative reduplicant, grammatical subject is theme. Straightforward. 8. With CVC bases. Okay, now that's again circumstances theme. It's a prepositional phrase. You didn't put the textual first, though. Unlike and but and or, which must come at the beginning, however, it can sort of drift, right? You could put it at the beginning. You can put it in the middle. You can even put it at the end. However, it sort of drifts where you want to put it. It still indicates a kind of relationship with what was said before. The denotative appears, all right? So now the denotative is subject, but it's not theme. What's theme? With CVC bases. 8b, as predicted. Again, now that's one clause. It has a verb. 8b, as predicted. 8c, but textual theme. The iterative reduplicant, grammatical subject appears. 8D, thus avoiding. Sorry, there's another thing I need to correct there. 8D, thus. That should be what? That should be a textual theme. All right. Okay, so how are we doing? Any questions so far? Are we following on okay, I hope? Seems to be okay. Let's keep going then. 9. We also address, all right, we, again, theme. Another one of those embedded, an issue. What issue? That Urbanchik has left open to research. Again, it is rank shifted. It's modifying issue. 9C, these, whether, those are both textual. This process, grammatical subject to theme, the verb is. 10. Grammatical subject, straightforward, suggests that. 10B, what kind of clause do we say? We said it's a projecting clause. That the enhancement of morphological contrast, again, the grammatical subject is diachronic. Certain reduplicants, grammatical subject as theme, have been phonologically enhanced. I've included everything here in terms of the pre-modifiers, more or less of the verb, but it's all part of the predicate, part of the process. All right. To serve. Okay, to serve is it's not, again, it's the to infinitive form of the verb, so it's not a finite clause, it's a non-finite clause, but still it's a clause. 11, grammatical subject as theme, verb has. Clause 12, for distributive, it is again the circumstance as theme, is formed. Now, again, you notice that there have been certain reduplicants have been phonologically enhanced in clause 10C. 12 is formed. Do you begin to see another aspect of what is academic writing? Passive voice. 13, on the other hand, textual, because you're describing it this side, that side, so forth. On the other hand, plurals, the subject. Now, notice something here. 13A continues. Sorry, I want to get the highlighter here. 13A, you notice, is here, and it's here. It's interrupted by 13B. 13B is, again, it's a relative clause. You notice that it is set off by commas. What does that indicate? If you have a relative clause that is set off by commas, it is not a defining relative clause. It is a non-defining relative clause. It's a difference. Plurals, and then you're giving some information about plurals. You're not distinguishing a specific some plurals as opposed to other plurals. You're just saying plurals in general are usually formed by vowel reduplication. And so you're just giving additional information. It's a non-defining relative clause. It isn't a post-modifier of plurals. So it's treated as a separate clause. Commas are very important here. The punctuation tells the reader this is a defining, this is a non-defining relative clause. Okay, so 13B is a clause. It stands alone. It's a relative clause. Now, the which, okay, what is that? Is that textual or is that ideational? in a way, it's both, and that's why I put it in purple here, all right? It's textual in a certain sense that it must occur there at the beginning, the relative pronouns. It is a connector with what came before, but also as a stand-in for what it is you're describing, plurals. So it does have sort of a textual and an ideational element to it. Okay, so 13a, on the other hand, textual theme, plurals, ideational theme. The verb is way down here, have. So you can have clauses that can interrupt other clauses, such as would be the case with non-defining relative clauses. Okay, why also in, why to serve is also the main verb. I think that occurred previously, right? Where were we? Where was that? To serve. Which clause was that? Does the person who, Cheng Ho Ying, 10D. Let's go back then. 10D, I missed it. Okay, to serve. Now, the question you're asking is, why is it also the main verb? It is a main verb. 10D, it's to serve, enhanced, and this clause expresses what? Purpose, the to infinitive. The to infinitive form of the verb, it's non-finite, so it's a dependent clause, but it is still a clause. And why it is a clause is because it does have a verb, which is to serve. Okay? I have a concern that maybe you guys aren't realizing the difference between what I've been calling a dependent clause and an embedded clause. Okay, so let me just briefly again sort of say 10D would be an example of a dependent clause. It's fully functioning. It is a clause. It has a non-finite verb, the to infinitive. We use the to infinitive to express purpose. All right, so that is a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. Certain reduplicants, 10C on the other hand, certain reduplicants have been phonologically enhanced. That could stand alone. So there's a hypotactic relationship here. The main clause is 10C. 10D is the other part of that hypotaxis. It's not the main clause, it's the dependent clause. Now, this is different than what we've been looking at here in, well, let's find another previous example of the, okay, 6 examples, and 6b is not a dependent clause. It is a post-modifier of examples. It is a post-modifier of a noun. And so that now that relationship is one that's not, it's not hypotactic, it's not paratactic, it's, we could say it's embedded, because the clause that is being embedded has been shifted. Instead of being a clause, it's now functioning like it is part of a phrase. Okay, so I hope we made that point. There was another question, 9A. 9A. We also addressed an issue that Urbanchik has left open to future research. I don't quite get the question why 9A doesn't count as textual. We is the grammatical subject. All right, we in 9A is the ideational theme. It's not textual, it's we, right? It's the grammatical subject. 9C, these whether, for example, whether, those are textual, all right? Those are textual indicators. This process would be the grammatical subject, it would be the ideational theme. Okay, I think that we had gotten up to 14. We, again, grammatical subject, argue, that vowel lengthening, all right? That, again, this is a projected clause. Again, do you see something else that has been continually we see, and that is the use of verbs that, because this is the abstract for an article, it is telling what they wrote. It's explaining, it's sort of summarizing what they did in the abstract. And what they did in the abstract is communicate an idea. So you begin to see a lot of verbs that project, verbs that are, we might say, are verbal. All right, we argue. And that, and it's the that, it's a that clause, it's a projected clause. Was innovated, passive voice. 14C, to enhance. To enhance, again, is it's the verb. Again, it's a non-finite verb. It expresses the purpose. We are nearly the end, all right? So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to avoid looking at the chat window for now. I'll look at it when we come time to have the break. I'll take a look at any of the questions or anything that you have to ask, and then I'll come back to it when we come back from the break. But let me finish the text first, all right? Evidence for this grammatical subject includes, straightforward, 15b, to mark, all right, again, the to infinitive, purpose. Finally, textual theme, because it's indicating how it where it comes in the text itself, all right? Finally, we, grammatical subject, theme, present evidence. 16b, what kind of evidence? That homophony avoidance extends beyond the domain of reduplication. What kind of evidence? And this describes that kind of evidence. 17. Bauer, 2003, grammatical subject, claims, straightforward. Projected clause, that, textual theme. Grammatical subject, certain expected patterns of productive morphology. Can be blocked, predicate, process. 17C, if, grammatical subject, verb. 17D, for example, textual. French voler is not used. 17, rather straightforward. Okay, the way that we've analyzed the previous sentences, again, it's the same applies here. Again, in 18, I don't see anything sort of surprising here. Additionally, textual theme, Mosul, 2003, grammatical subject, shows, again, another verbal process that projects, 18b, that, textual theme. In Samoan, again, where, because you're talking about the languages, what can happen in those languages, that's the grammatical subject, but it's not theme. 18c, straightforward. 19, thus, textual theme. We, grammatical subject, present, and we support. Okay, I think these proposals, again, 19C, again, sort of modifying proposals, all right? All right, so that is a run through of these, of the way I've done the clause analysis here. And in going through it, I've tried to highlight certain points which I hope will be helpful to you as you go through it. When we come back after the break, I'll answer any questions you have on the chat, and at the same time, we'll go on because I want to now take what we've done as far as the analysis of the clauses, and then look at how this is put together. What is its rhetorical structure? Okay, we'll take a break now. And as I see the time, it's almost just 10:02, and we'll take a break and see you at the at the top of the hour. All right, see you then. Okay, I've tried to reply, I believe, to the various, anything that came through in the chat. If I somehow missed something or didn't fully address a question that you had, please do let me know. And again, I will now we're going to be sort of shifting our attention to looking at it from the standpoint of not just the analyzing the clauses, and you will get more practice in doing that kind of thing, because what we're going to be doing is you'll be analyzing a text, and you will be analyzing it in terms of its clause structure, adding those tags to indicate the clause breakdown and so forth. This is the kind of thing that you will be doing for your teamwork, all right? And another element of that, of course, will be the rhetorical structure theory, all right? Looking at the text from the standpoint of its architecture. So the kinds of analysis that I'm talking about today are the kinds of things you'll do as far as your sort of teamwork. Now, let me put your mind at ease, though, about like when it comes to the exam. When it comes to the exam, what I do is I do not give you a text to analyze. On the exam, I will give you a text that is analyzed. I'll give you a text that is already analyzed in terms of clause structure on the exam. When it comes to your teamwork and the presentations that you'll make, you will do the analysis. You have time to think through and discuss with other team members and so forth. And we will soon be organizing what those teams will be. More details about that later, though. My point is, as far as when it comes to the examination itself, all right, when you do the exam, I'm not going to ask you to do the analysis as part of the exam. Instead, I'll give you an analyzed text. Now, you might say, what's the point then? Because the point of this course is not just how to analyze. It's once you've analyzed and once you've got your data, what observations are you going to make from it? What does the data tell you about the nature of that text? What does the data tell you about how that text made meaning? That's where I really feel this course is important. It's not just for you to learn how to analyze a text and find the clauses and so forth. That's how you end up with your data. But the next step is taking that data, looking for the patterns that are going to tell you something about how that text made meaning and whether that text made meaning effectively, how you evaluate that text, how you compare that text with others. Okay? That's the nature of this course. So it's not just learning to do, how to cut up a text into parts. That's only getting your data. The next is really the most important, and that is being able to make observations about that data. But then again, that's what we're going to be going through. And the next thing is how you analyze a text into its coherent structure. And I've talked about rhetorical structure theory, okay? And I've given you a link before about for rhetorical structure theory, a website that basically gives examples, more examples, and more discussion about the theory itself. And I've also put on the in Canvas a list of the relations, okay? Because there are these relations that make up the rhetorical structure. We're saying that a text is hierarchically structured from the various smallest unit, grammatical unit, the clause, up to the text as a whole, and every hierarchically arranged along this. The texts sort of pair up, and the pairs are related through a finite set of relations, which are then defined in rhetorical structure theory. And we map out then this rhetorical structure, saying that the main idea indicated with that vertical line, okay, okay, in that vertical line indicates that is that paragraphs, well, basically it was this first sentence, all right, though I found Megan's column informative and topical, a few aspects troubled me. That's the main idea. And everything else, your paragraph 2, 3, and 4 is all elaborating on that point, and these are the arcs point from this sort of these satellites to the nucleus. That's how they describe it. The nucleus being sort of the main idea. So the idea being that the letter writer is saying, yeah, okay, informative and topical, a few aspects troubled me, and then elaborates. It gives the general statement and then followed by the specifics. And that then, we go down to clause level, we had concession, and we define, concession is defined in rhetorical structure theory, and we said that the definition of that relation is semantic. We say that the nucleus, how is the nucleus defined? Not saying that it's the grammatically, the main clause, the independent clause. No, it's saying that the writer has positive regard for the situation presented in the nucleus. Now, I talked about that last time, and the idea being that when you talk about the text, you're interpreting the text, and its semantics, its meaning, and that's what you're trying to represent here with its rhetorical structure. It's how you interpret it. So please, on Canvas, if you go back to week 3, I loaded it up at week 3, and I do want you to, good idea is to familiarize yourself with these relations, the RST relations and the definitions of those relations, okay? So good idea for you to get that in hand and be taking a look at it. And what you'll see is something that looks like this, in which you have the various relations and then you have them defined, all right? So you have, for example, interpretation defined here. The reader, the reader, recognizes that S, the speaker, relates the nucleus to a framework of ideas not involved in the knowledge presented in the nucleus itself, all right? And further information here, and the nucleus and the satellite, some constraints. The satellite relates the nucleus to a framework of ideas not involved in the nucleus itself, not concerned with the writer's positive regard. It's not in it, it's trying to distinguish it from the previous one, evaluation. It's not a judgment, it's how you assess it. It's how you interpret it, all right? So, my advice is, get that document, RST relations, print it out, have it handy, so that when we talk about the various relations and assign the relations, it's something that you can then refer to, okay? All right, now come back to the point. When we talk about rhetorical structure, we're talking about a texture. Not the inter-sentence texture, which is cohesiveness, but an intra-sentence texture. Now, this is the curious point, because you intra-sentence, you think it's within the sentence, but it's because it's the choices within the sentence that are made sentence by sentence, clause by clause, but it's cumulative. The choices that you're making, the choice that you make here is based on the choice that you made previously. and maybe even thinking ahead to what you're about to say. And so I want to illustrate that with, remember we pointed out how we kept seeing Urbanchik at the beginning as theme? Urbanchik 2005, second sentence, Urbanchik shows, down to 5, Urbanchik's claim. It's all about Urbanchik. And where do you put that information? You put in theme. And that continuous thematic progression, that continuity, marks off sort of a block of text. It's a kind of cohesiveness. It's a kind of texture. It's a pattern. The pattern is the choice of theme. Continuous, continuity. You have 1 through 5, sort of, they're all about Urbanchik. And then in 6, what happens? In this paper, it shifts. It's not about Urbanchik anymore. You now shifted to the focus. What you're talking about now is the paper. You're not talking about Urbanchik anymore. And you're going to be talking about what you're going to say, we. But see how theme, what you put first, is sort of guiding me, the reader, to know that 1 through 5, yes, that was about Urbanchik. Now, oh, yes, in this paper, we. Marked difference here, all right? And now notice 6 in this paper, we, 9, we, 16, we, 19, we. This is now about the authors of this paper. This is what they say. This is what they are concluding. This is what they are presenting, what they are providing. Okay? And you notice the verbs are all, because of the nature of this writing here is an abstract. You're telling people what you are going to present them, what you're going to provide for them. And so it's all guided by the purpose. The purpose of this abstract is to tell people what your paper is about. Okay? And the choice of verb is important. It is related to the nature of the text itself. But what I'm highlighting here is we. Here you've shifted now, and it's about what you are going to be presenting. All right, so now, the print is small. That's why I suggested to you, you might want to have it handy, all right? And I sure hope you're not looking at this on a phone. If you are, it's going to be difficult. I hope you're looking at it on a computer screen, all right? If not, what I recommend later when you go back to look at the video, go back and display it on a computer screen so you can see it a bit better. There it should display okay. All right, now 1 through 5, Urbanchik, right? The idea being that 1 through 5, that is like one span. And that continuity, we said, was brought out to us by the fact that you kept repeating the same thing as theme. Urbanchik's claim. All right? There's sort of a symmetry here. Urbanchik 2005, 1 extends. Urbanchik in the second sentence, Urbanchik shows, and then you start to say what Urbanchik shows. That's in 2 through 5. But you notice the symmetry. Urbanchik here, Urbanchik in 2, and then it proceeds down and talks about what Urbanchik was saying. I'm going to continue. Now, remember I said to you, you have those textual sort of themes along the way. And what is their purpose? Their purpose is to guide you as to, they are to signal to you the makeup, how this text is being presented. What are they signaling? They're signaling the coherent structure of the text. And that's what, for example, in 3, that's what it's about. Okay, for example, it illustrates it, that's elaboration. And the whole part that follows from 3 to 5, that is all part of this kind of example that they're giving. Okay, so we can treat that 3 through 5 all as one span of text. Now, By span, you notice I'm linking them all together as like a line, right? What I'm saying is that when you have, for example, it's illustrating and it elaborates on what was mentioned previously. That would be the core idea. You're giving another example then. That example is going to be the satellite. All right, now let's take it apart here, 2A through C. 2A, Urbanchik shows. What did I say that was? Projection. And then you have a that clause. That in various Salish Austronesian languages, reduplicants of identical shape can have different surface realizations, 2C, depending on their morphological function. When you say depends on this, it's a condition of something. The relationship is one of condition. Now you might say, how did I decide on these relations? Well, to some extent, when you see sort of like depending, that sort of says it quite explicitly. It's a condition of something. But when I do a rhetorical structure analysis, I do need to have that set of definitions handy. Handy, even if it's just to decide what is the nucleus and what is the satellite. Because that is how it's supposed to be. Rhetorical structure theory, the definitions of these relations tell you not only the nature of that relationship, but what should be the nucleus, what should be the satellite. 3 through 5. All right, now let's take a look at it. In 4, whereas the distributive requires an identical stress. I'm reading 4A, I'm reading that part there, all right? Whereas the distributive requires an identical stress pattern in reduplicant and base. I'm going to skip what's in parentheses. Parentheses, if it were a clause, I would analyze it. I think one of you asked in the chat, what about what's in parentheses? But if it's just additional information, I'm just going to leave it. It's all basically here, especially it's just an example that's nouns. All right. Let me get back to 4B. The diminutive requires a stress shift. Urbanchik's claim is that this stress shift functionally serves to differentiate the two duplemes. If there was no difference in stress, then the resulting surface forms would be homogeneous and therefore ambiguous. All right, so how is this all put together? Well, let's see. For example, and then it mentions this Austronesian. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name of that language. Uses full root reduplication for repetitive, distributive, and diminutive. Now you notice in 3, it mentions repetitive, distributive, diminutive. More general statement about reduplication for both of these, all right, repetitive, distributive, and diminutive. And then it goes on in 4 and 5 to explain the difference, all right? Whereas for the distributive requires an identical stress pattern in their duplicate and base, the diminutive requires a stress shift. Okay, so it then is more or less giving you additional information about the two. Now, let's get to 4, all right? 4A, 4B. Whereas, what does whereas describe? It describes the contrast between 4A and 4B. All right, so the whereas, the distributive requires this, 4B, the diminutive requires that. It's a contrast. Right? It's not antithesis, remember? It's not taking a stand on one side or the other. It's just, this is the distributive, this is the diminutive, all right? There's how they're different. And you use the word whereas to indicate that. 5A, when you read it, what does it say? Urbanchik's claim is that this stress shift functionally serves to differentiate the two duplemes. If there was no difference in stress, then the resulting surface forms would be homogeneous and therefore ambiguous. now let's take a look at this. All right, so there's a lot here to sort of unpack, and let's take the easy one first. All right, if condition. All right, and if and then, that's easy. The otherwise, well, if you take a look at the definitions of the relations, what is this saying? And you do have to sort of understand it. All right, to get an idea what's being said. You're saying that whereas the distributive requires this and the diminutive requires that, Urbanchik's claim is that this stress shift functionally serves to differentiate the two duplemes if there was no difference in stress. So it's saying that this contrast serves this purpose. If it didn't have this stress, didn't have this difference, if it didn't have this stress shift, there would not be a way to differentiate between them. So that's why I've identified it as otherwise. All right. Whereas this seems to be the case, A and B, Urbanchik's claim is if it didn't have this sort of stress shift, you couldn't distinguish between the two. All right, so we've unpacked this part here. You begin to see, yes, a lot of it is going to depend on those words that you're going to use to indicate the textual relations. Those guide you. Sometimes, yes, you do have to really understand what it is being said. Now, when I come back to 6 through 8, well, 7, elaboration. I see, for example, there. When it comes down to 7a and 8a, I see, however, I know there's contrast there. Well, that was straightforward and just based on identifying those textual markers. I see but occurs twice, all right, 7c and 8c. Contrast both levels, all right, between 7 and 8, the however, 7a, 7c, 8ab, and 8cd. Again, contrast. Again, the 8c and d, let's take a look at it. But the iterative or duplicant appears as a light syllable prefix, thus avoiding the otherwise expected homophony. If it weren't for this light syllable prefix, otherwise you'd have the expected homophony. That's why I identified it as otherwise. Now, sometimes what the writer says is just straightforward, the evidence, the evidence. And on that basis, looking at it, yes, they're simply offering evidence for the conclusions that they're drawing. We argue that, well, that's in 14, that's straightforward, that's projection. In 11 through 13, now there's no word, for example. I had to read it. I had to sort of understand what was being said, to understand that what was being described here, 11 through 13, was elaboration. I'm not saying that as you go through it, everything is all laid out so obviously, all right? To the extent that the writer does give you the clues as to its coherent structuring, to the extent that it is easier for you to, in a sense, map it out, well, that's the more coherent that text will be. The more that the reader is required to sort of read it, to figure out how things are connected, without sort of some kind of textual markers to do so, that says something about the nature of the text. So as you do a kind of analysis like this, some of the things you'll see stand out to you. Oh yes, if, okay, condition, says that's projection. Okay, and however, and whereas, and all those words tell you something about the nature of those relations. But where a text doesn't, well, there is saying to you also then something about how well that writer has put across their ideas so that you can clearly see the coherent way in which they have been organized and presented to you. It's as, in other words, the more I have to sort of read it to figure it out, the more likely it is that I'm identifying perhaps a weakness within the way it's written. All right, now within that part, yes, between in 10 and 13, there are examples, all right? And I'm, for example, suggests that, that's projection, 10A, all right, 10B. 10D, to serve, that was purpose, all right, that indicated purpose. 13A, contrast on the other hand, all right, again, that lays it out there. So those elements there within the sort of the nature of those clauses, I see the relations between them. On the other hand, and then remember that 13B, that non-defining relative clause? Well, that would be a kind of elaboration. That non-defining clause is an elaboration. So do you see something else? What's the difference between parataxis and hypotaxis and rank shifting? If it's rank shifted, if it's embedded, if it's the level clause has been turned into part of a noun phrase, it doesn't appear on our map here. It doesn't, we aren't drawing lines to somehow see its connection, because what we're only displaying here are the connections between, at the bottom level, at the lowest level, clauses. And then how those sort of clauses combine to form a part. So like we've said, 11 through 13, it's a kind of elaboration. 12 and 13 elaborate on 11, all right? Clauses hierarchically become sentences with more than one clause. 13A and 13B is a sentence, right? And those sentences combine to form larger units as we work our way up to the text as a whole. So we are only mapping out hypotaxis, parataxis relations. But there's another point here to make, and that is that, notice, hypotaxis and parataxis does not just occur between clauses. It occurs between these larger chunks of text. As we work ourselves up the hierarchy, it is still a relationship of hypotaxis and parataxis. Those relations, if they're asymmetrical, it's hypotactic. They're symmetrical, it's paratactic. Parataxis, hypotaxis, it occurs throughout this hierarchical structure. The same kind of description applies whether it's between clauses or between paragraphs. Getting to the end, additionally, would be telling us joint, all right? Again, we have projection, we have elaboration, we have condition, if. So the markers are there. They tell us how the text is put together. When it gets to 19, thus, right, we concluded. There's a few more, 18A, 18C, 18B and C, again, if. All right, so the point being, when we map out the structure here, what we are mapping out is the coherent structure. And you as a writer can make very clear to your reader what is the coherent structuring of your text. You can signal it, or you cannot, or you may not. And if you don't, though, you put the burden on the reader. Figure out how this all comes out, all right? Now, when you want a text to be clearly understood, the best is that you signal and you mark it. Now, when we are analyzing it, what we're analyzing is what is that structuring? What is that mapping out that occurs? And when I see the to infinitive, I know that it's going to be purpose. When I see by, verb ing, I know it's going to be means. If I see if, I know it's condition. If I see but, no, it doesn't. It may be contrast. It may be concession. So there are obvious signals to us. And as we work our way, and as we map out a text, what you are doing is you are giving your sort of theory about how that text is put together. All right, now, again, as I said, we're going to be doing more of this as we go through. And some of you have taken the course that I teach on writing, and always my encouragement is for students to pay attention in your writing to your coherent mapping of your ideas, for asking yourself, how easy are you making it for the reader? All right, so we will be taking a look, but this gives you an idea in analyzing this text, the kind of thing that we would be looking for. All right, now I'm going to shift gears quite a bit. All right, we're going to shift and take a look at verbal art and verbal science. This is sort of one of my favorite areas to be looking at, my favorite topics. All right, and what we're going to be looking at is, what is it in language that enables us to produce innovation? Innovation, whether that means in science or creativity, as in the arts. And when I talk about art, I'm talking about poetry, I'm talking about drama. So what is it that sort of enables this creativity in language? All right, so let me read this as sort of a summary of where we will be going, whether it is the art in verbal art or the science in verbal science. What is being crafted through the metaphor-making potential available in language are hypotheses or models about the world experienced around us and in us. Such is the semogenic power of grammar. Remember what semogenic? Making meaning, power to make meaning. That it enables us to define the basic experience of being human. Hassan, Professor Ruqayya Hassan, refers to the hypotheses articulated in verbal art as themes about some aspect of social life achieved through a second order of semiosis, a kind of double articulation, so that one order of meaning acts as a metaphor for a second order of meaning. I know this sounds complicated and abstract, but we're going to be taking a look. And I hope that what you will realize is that in perhaps reading a poem, you begin to realize that there is another message there. It's not just laid out for you. What we've just been talking about is how you can make it lay out the structure so it's easy to comprehend. And now we're going to be doing something else. We're going to turn it around. How does the artist put in another level of meaning, a deeper meaning into what's there that and you may not see it and you may not realize it, but it's being communicated to you nonetheless. The other side is scientific theorizing. Halliday's point here is scientific theorizing would not be possible except by means of the semogenic potential in language to reconstrue our common sense view of experience as the interplay between happenings and entities into a metaphorical world of things which can be observed, investigated, and explained. What does it mean? It means that you can use language, and this has been done by scientists. And that is to sort of take the normal way that we see the world and can sort of create a different perspective on the world. Historically speaking, this metaphor-making potential has been achieved over 3 successive waves of theoretical energy: generalization, abstractness, metaphor, each taking us one step further away from ordinary experience. But at the same time, each step may be thought of as having enlarged the meaning potential by adding a new dimension to the model. Over the course of history, as the need arose for new ways to theorize the human experience, humankind has relied on the power of language to reconstrue common sense reality into one that imposed regularities on experience and brought the environment more within our power to control. My hope is that when I finish discussing this topic, this summary will make sense to you. I don't think it probably does now, because you haven't yet seen it. But my goal, in most likely won't be completing it in this lecture, but this lecture and the next to follow, is to let you see it. So I begin with a question. What is metaphor? Because what we're basically going to be saying is that this creativity in language rests on the ability to make metaphor. And I've been very influenced by, I want to get rid of this. Let's see. Okay. That yellow highlighter, I didn't want it. No. I've been very influenced not just by Professor M.A.K. Halliday, Professor Ruqaiya Hasan. I've also been fascinated by what has been written on this subject by Russell Mears. Russell Mears, Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry, the Westmead Clinical School, University of Sydney. And he's done a great deal of work in his area of psychiatry. He wrote a book, The Poet's Voice in the Making of Mind. And if you were to find a book to read, I'm not telling you that you need to read it for this course, but a really interesting book. If this at all, what I'm going to be talking about, interests you, I strongly recommend this book to you, all right? It's, again, one of these books that has inspired me. In this book, he says, metaphor's most important function is to picture that which cannot be seen, and so to say what otherwise cannot be said. It's a picture-making function of metaphor. Now, what is metaphor? I give this example, and I realize that this example is probably a bit culture-specific. When I say Tim is a rock, well, in English, I think, and I think to other native English speakers, when you say Tim is a rock, it's a positive point. He's strong. He's solid. He's someone you can depend on. Now that's the when I say it, what's happening? What you're saying is that Tim takes on the qualities of rockness. Now, I realize in some other cultures, if you said that, they may take it to mean he's stubborn, all right? That's not how I'd mean it. What I'm picturing is, and I think for many native English speakers, I think Chinese culture is a bit different, I think. Tim is a rock. If I say that, it's a positive thing. And what I'm attributing to Tim is the qualities that I see in rocks. They're strong, they're hard, they're firm, they're solid. Well, what is a lexical metaphor? Lexical metaphor is something that you see all the time. You see it in the movies too.
It's time for the Ravagers to rise once again to glory with a new captain, Taserface!
I'm sorry. Your name is... It's Taserface?
That's right.
Do you shoot tasers out of your face?
It's metaphorical!
For what?
For it is a name what strikes fear into the hearts of anyone what hears it.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, whatever you say.
You shut up. You're next.
Okay. Whether it's Tim is a rock or Taserface, what we're saying is that metaphors make possible the representation of states of feeling and imagination. And substance is given to an otherwise amorphous, difficult to hold on to, fleeting reality. This kind of reality is the heart of those relationships that are unique to the human primate, central to the creation of culture. Now, this is an important point. This kind of reality, which can be represented metaphorically, it's unique. What is being said is that it is unique to the human primate. It is central to our creation of culture. There's a phrase I like a lot. In fact, it comes, though, from another book of Russell Mears. And this one, it was his clinician's manual on borderline personality disorder and the conversational model. In other words, as a psychiatrist, his approach to dealing with patients with borderline personality disorder is a sort of conversational method, how you talk to them. That's what fascinated me in looking at what he is saying about this particular approach. Now, the other book is also, as I mentioned, though a bit different, related to the poetry, and that really fascinated me. But there's a line in this book which says something like this: a metaphoric cinematic screen on which is portrayed a partially glimpsed personal reality. Think about that a minute. It's almost like when you're using metaphor, it's almost like you're projecting a movie. And what are you projecting in this movie? A partially glimpsed personal reality. Partially glimpsed because we never see everything, right? And it is personal. It is subjective. And how do I get what's inside here? How do I get that partially glimpsed personal reality out to you when I'm trying to express it? And it's something like he's saying, a metaphoric cinematic screen. How do I project this view of reality? Now that's metaphor as we usually understand it, right? Tim is a rock. He is the quality of rockness. All right. So what is Halliday, though, talks about something else. He's saying that there is grammatical metaphor. So think about this. He says, when you talk normally. He calls it a relation of congruence. How do you represent things? Nouns. Qualities, adjectives. Processes is verbs, and so on. So what he's saying is what is congruent? It's sort of the straightforward. It's sort of the default. It's the direct, all right? So things are nouns, verbs are processes are verbs, and so on. That's how we see the world. That's how we construe the world. So let's sort of draw a figure to sort of map this out. And so we're saying that you have meaning as one layer, you have wording as another, and they are connected, they're tied up. So things are nouns, and relators are conjunctions, and processes are verbs, all right? Can we redraw it? Yes, we can. In other words, I can take a process and I can turn it into a noun. But when I do so, what happens? I give it the quality of nounness. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that if I say nouns, things are typically nouns. What is a noun? Noun is a thing. It is the quality of thingness, so to speak. And so when I take a verb and I turn it into a noun, it becomes something. So grammatical metaphor becomes a means to innovate in language at the level of structure, grammar. Just like traditional metaphor is the basis of innovations at the level of words. All right, so we have grammatical metaphor, we have lexical metaphor. Now picture this in the language of science. So for example, in this, what's in sort of this red color here, the solvent tends to be drawn through. Okay, that's verbal. That's said it is a verb. It's a process. Drawn through the membrane into the solution, thus diluting it. Okay, so it's all been very much expressed like you would in a congruent way. Then what happens? You repackage it all in the next sentence at the beginning as the subject, as something, as a noun, as a nominalization. You turn all those verbs, drawing through, diluting, into this movement of the solvent across the membrane. You turn the happening into a something. Now, I earlier illustrated to you something from Donald Jung's speech, A Tale of Two Systems. And if you remember, in that I was talking about processes, and I was making the point that in his speech, when he talks about doing, very often it's not people doing, but it's events, abstract ideas, it's things, not people, that are doing. And that sort of seemed to be the way he construes the world. We say that's his ideology. And he even says that. He even outright says it. And when he gives this quote from Emerson, things are in the saddle and ride mankind. So you remember that? You remember our talking about that earlier? And at that point, I was trying to make the point that, yes, how we construe the world in terms of process, participant, circumstance, really does say something about how we make meaning, how we view the world. Okay, now that was my point then. It's not the point I'm going to make today. Here I want to focus on just the last paragraph of what he said here. And this is paragraph 13. And in this paragraph, okay, he says this. At one level, you can read that as a lesson on the need for humility. that those who seek to lead events must accept that often the event leads them. But at another level, it is a reminder of the power of ideas to move men to action well beyond the reach of those who had the ideas. Right now we have two ideas here. At one level, this. At another level, this. Which of these two do you think he is trying to give greater emphasis to? Or do you suppose that they are sort of equal? One level this, one level that. Sort of they're paratactic, symmetrical. It's even, all right? Or is there one that's sort of heavier, stronger? One is more emphasizing than the other. Take a look. What do you think? At one level, you can read that as a lesson on the need for humility. That those who seek to lead events must accept that often the event leads them. But at another level, it is a reminder of the power of ideas to move men to action well beyond the reach of those who had the ideas. Where I tell you to take a look is I tell you to take a look at the verbs. At one level, you can read that. What's read? Read here is more mental. It's more, you can understand that. You can perceive that, right? It's mental. And it's modified even also by some modality. It's a possibility. It's a possibility that you can understand this that way. But at another level, it is a reminder of the power of ideas. Now notice he doesn't say it reminds us of the power of ideas. He could have. And if he did, it would be remind, which would also be mental, and also what's going on in your head. But he doesn't do that, though. Instead, what he says, it is a reminder. He takes the verb remind, and he gives it the quality of nounness. He turns it into a thing. He turns it into something that's concrete. He turns it into something that has substance. It is real. And the verb is now is. It is the verb to be. It exists. You see, I really believe that in doing this, whether or not it was in his head to do that or not, is regardless not the point. Here, very clearly, one of these, but at another level, he has given it a quality of being something that truly is. It exists. It isn't just in your head. And he does this through grammar, through the power of grammatical metaphor. Okay, I think it's time, before I go on to the next part, which I don't want to be interrupted for the break. I'm going to stop here. Anyways, it's time for a break. So let's stop here for a moment, and we'll take a break and resume at the top of the hour. All right? Okay. See you later. Okay, let's begin again. And I hope you all are seeing the screen okay now, and everything is working all right. By the way, there is a survey that I put up for you to respond. Some of you have, a number of you have, but some number of you haven't. And this is about going forward. How do you prefer through sort of Zoom sessions like what we're doing here, or a hybrid model, where I guess on, it seems it would be rotational basis, students who wish to could come to the class, sort of, so that sort of the choice was either Zoom, continuing as we're sort of doing it now, or a more hybrid model going forward. And what you personally would prefer along those lines. I'll wait to see what your responses are, and I think the survey I put up, I think it's still there, and so you still have a chance to respond. All right, what your preference is. I'm not really sure how the hybrid model would work, because from what I can see from the responses so far, most, quite a strong majority, prefer the Zoom method that we're doing now. And I too can see there is a benefit in the fact that what we're doing with the Zoom, this sort of interaction with the camera and with you via the camera and the microphone and so forth. To me, I when I look back at the video, for example, I do feel it probably gives the fact that you can go back over it and see what's been said and how it's explained and so forth. There is an advantage to that. And in some respects, I almost surprisingly have felt that in sort of the Zoom sessions, a bit sort of closer to you, in the sense, even though I don't see you, I can interact with you in a way that I'm in previously, as when I've lectured and so forth, I wouldn't have likely been doing. I mean, very often when you're lecturing, students don't raise their hand and don't respond. And but in this kind of interaction, in some respects, it does seem to be allow for a level of interaction that I think can be quite positive. But nonetheless, let's see what your feelings are, and if you want to express more than what's just in the survey, feel free to email me and comment as well. Okay, and I do hope that the videos now, the video last time I did put on my OneDrive, because of copyright reasons and so forth. The videos that were part of it could not be displayed. I had to cut those out for the most part, or cut the audio for them if I put them on YouTube. But I put more or less the full the full session on the OneDrive, and I hope that you were able to access that without any difficulty. All right, again, sorry for, it's not drilling, but it's pounding, and I hope that doesn't intrude too much into what you hear, all right, and so forth. Try to ignore it if you can. All right, so come back to this. Now, what we've been talking about is this sort of metaphor making ability that we have. And you remember Mears said that it almost defines us in terms of being human, this ability to make metaphor. What is this ability to make metaphor? Where does it come from? How does it originate? And what Halliday, now I'm going to share with you two perspectives on this. The first I'm going to share with you is Halliday's perspective. And the second is Mears' perspective. And both of these men, while they knew each other, they didn't interact on this subject. And so what I'm about to share with you about their two approaches is not based on the fact that the two sort of met and discussed it and came up with their views. It, in fact, is what's been quite interesting is to find how their approaches are in many respects share something in common. Okay, first Halliday. Now, Halliday's point is that if you look back at the way language develops in a child, what you notice is that little children do not use metaphors. Do not use metaphors. They seem to go through several stages, all right? And the first stage that children go through is the ability to generalize. And that means that where they would go from just using proper nouns, mommy, daddy, addressing mommy, daddy, to being able to think in terms of class of nouns. That's a mommy, that's a daddy. In other words, going from proper nouns to common nouns and thinking of it sort of in a almost taxonomical way where you have classes of more than one class of classes, so to speak. So generalization occurs for children between the age 1 to 2 years. The next stage, children are between age 4 to 6 years. And here they're getting to the point where they are able to use abstractness. In other words, taking concrete categories like big, small, and being able to abstract it into size. Tall, short, height. In other words, being able to think in terms of not concrete categories, but abstract categories. And so taking the way we think in common sense terms and re-theorizing it in an uncommon sense way. Now, the next sort of level occurs around age 9 to 13, and this is where metaphor seems to emerge. Going from the sort of the primary way of construing things to a secondary way of construing it, reconstruing it, re-representing something. Now, Halliday talks about that as being a non-linear step. Why is that non-linear? Why aren't we sort of going in the same direction? Isn't metaphor really sort of another level of abstraction? And very often we're talking about it as verbs into nouns. It seems that we're becoming more abstract, right? But Halliday sees it differently. He suggests that this is really a nonlinear step. You're not going in the same direction. Metaphor takes you, in fact, in a different direction. Well, what direction are we going then? What's this nonlinear step? What's this step aside, all right, in a different direction? Now, Halliday likens this as two steps in one direction and one step to either side. This being like in chess, Western style chess, you have this one piece called the horse that can move, or some people call it the horse, some people call it the knight. And in fact, Halliday calls it the knight, and he calls this the knight's move, moving in two steps in one direction, and then a step aside, a non-linear step. Now, why? Professor David Butt, in an article, he said this, the knight's move is a non-linear step in the development of higher orders of discourse construction. Okay? And it goes on to say, abstraction needs to be distinguished from mere abstractness. Abstraction needs to be distinguished from mere abstractness. What does that mean? How can you distinguish abstraction from abstractness? It's to say that you can be more abstract, another level of abstraction that has less abstractness. Well, it does make sense, though. Because what we're really doing in the language of science is in this process of metaphor, grammatical metaphor, turning verbs into nouns, so to speak. This whole abstracting into the metaphorical is leading to the more concrete. Do you remember my illustration with Donald Jung? And what we were saying was that instead of saying it reminds us, it is a reminder. He gave that remind, instead of using the verb remind, something which goes on in your head, he turns it into a noun, so he turns it into something. And that something now has substance, it has reality, it's concrete. So quite paradoxically, the more abstract our theorizing, the more concrete the world becomes. We end up turning the world into a world of things. Now that is, yeah, I mean, you don't think about it in that respect, but it's true. What you've done is the direction you seem to be going in is more greater abstraction, but less abstract. Yes, because it becomes more concrete. Paradoxically, the more abstract the theorizing, the more concrete the world becomes. And that's why it's this non-linear step. Now, I said Mears also has a way of looking at this. Now, Mears talks about it like this, and this comes from, again, his book, The Poet's Voice in the Making of Mind. Yes, it begins with a thing. Okay, you have something. And what he's suggesting is that the first stage is sort of, you create a replica of something. You have the thing itself, and you have a direct copy of it, all right? And he calls it the homologue. The next stage would be analog. It isn't an exact copy. It isn't a replica. It resembles. It has qualities that resemble something else. Sometimes kids like to play with guns, all right? So maybe the parent goes out and buys a replica. It looks like a gun. It's a toy gun, but it's sort of a replica. And maybe a kid doesn't have that replica, that copy of a gun, and still wants to play sort of soldier. And so the kid goes and gets a stick and plays with it almost like it is a gun, or plays with it like it's a sword. The point being, it isn't a copy, it isn't a replica, but it's another stage. What are we doing? We are pattern matching. That is the direction that we seem to be moving and developing, and moving from a direct copy of something to something that resembles it, to the metaphorical. And again, Mears is saying that metaphorical step, though, is the non-linear step. It isn't following the same direction of pattern matching, of comparing like with like. Pattern matching, like with like, becomes comparing like with unlike. That's what metaphor is. Pattern matching leading from the comparison of like with like to like with unlike. Paradoxically, again, it's paradoxical. You are perceiving similarity in something that is dissimilar. You're finding a similarity in something that is completely dissimilar. That's the metaphorical. So in fact, both Halliday and Mears both are talking in similar language here, in the sense that what Halliday is saying, you're taking two steps in the direction of greater abstraction, but then you're taking that side non-linear step, that side step, moving from the abstract. The more abstract you are getting, the more concrete you become. And for Mears, he's saying that pattern matching is going from comparing like with like, and that is a common attribute, not just of humans, pattern matching, but of other primates as well. But then that sidestep, the paradoxical, comparing, seeing similarity in something that is completely dissimilar. It's the knight's move, Halliday calls it. The non-linear step in the direction of the paradoxical. No, scientific discourse. Halliday did an interesting study, and it began because Halliday was wanting to see why did children in school have difficulty with their science textbooks. What was it that made it difficult for students to be able to handle the language of science? And so what Halliday did was he went back into the history of the development of the English language to see what there was in, when did this change occur? Where did scientific discourse come from? Where did it originate out of? And he says this: history of scientific discourse reveals new strategies evolving, new ways of organizing the grammar as a resource for making meaning. As the need arose for more powerful and abstract theories of experience, humankind has been empowered by the metaphor-making potential of language. And what is the metaphor-making potential of language? Halliday says this: to reconstrue common sense reality into one that imposed regularities on experience and brought the environment more within our power to control it. By turning happenings into somethings, it imposed a regularity. It turned the dynamic verb into a static noun. It made it concrete, and thereby made the environment, made the world around us more easy to control, to measure, to describe. Now this happens in the language now, not just the language of science. It has permeated the way that we write. If you go and get a job in some either business or government or wherever, and you're writing, you are going to be writing like what we're talking about as being the language of science. Because, okay, example. And this example comes from Robin Fawcett, another well-known linguist from Cardiff University. Okay, he gives this example: the congruent. Remember the congruent, the default, the sort of the common sense way of talking, all right? Clausal way. They express everything as clauses. They educated the girls, or they educated girls, clause. Women acquired the vote, clause. They both have verbs, educated, acquired, right? And how do we relate these two events? We relate them by means of a conjunction. These two happenings, we relate them by a conjunction. The conjunction is the relation. But then, as is so often the case in the way we write, we turn these clauses into nominal groups, noun phrases. They educated the girls becomes the education of girls. Women acquire the vote, the acquisition of the vote by women. And what we see then is you have these two nominal groups representing two events. Now, how are they related? Not by a conjunction, because they're nouns. They're related by a verb, and that verb indicates how these two events are related. We've gone from the congruent to the incongruent, from the clausal to the nominal, and you saw it in that abstract that we were looking at earlier. All those rank shiftings, all those embeddings are indications of nominalization. In my own writing, I have to catch myself, and very often when I'm writing something and I go back over it, I see, wow, all nouns. I got to start making this at least a bit more about what people did, because that's a bit, in a way, it's, yeah, when you put it into verbs, it becomes sort of less abstract, right? But in fact, when we are doing all this abstracting, it becomes, again, more concrete. It's all about the things. It's a shift. You know, look at what's happening in the language. There's a shift now. The classes are being moved sideways. We have verbs and we have adjectives, and we turn them into nouns. Educated, education. Conjunctions are being replaced by verbs, so that instead of saying and then, we use preceded. These shift sideways in terms of grammatical categories, but structurally, it's almost a shift downwards from clause complexes, meaning that you have they educated girls and then women acquired the vote. That's a clause complex. That's two clauses joined together by a conjunction. And instead, you turned it into one clause with two nouns. The education of girls, noun. Preceded, that's the verb. The acquisition of the vote by women, a noun. That's a simple clause. In fact, you're turning more clausally complex into more clausally simple. I think most of the time, if you were thinking about the language of science and the way that we write, you'd say it's more complicated, it's more complex, it's less direct. But clausally, it's more simple. So then where does the complexity come from? From the fact that you pack in so much information into each of those noun phrases, those nominal groups. You pack all that information in there. It becomes lexically very dense, but grammatically simple. Halliday's analyses of scientific discourse reveal a broad form of grammatical drift that creates a novel intensity in the way writers in English can construe experience. Now, I want you to understand what he's saying there. What Halliday's done as far as looking at the language of science, there's a drift. There's a new novel intensity. Novel means new. Intensity, it's repeated a lot. It's turning everything into nouns. And the language is sort of drifted in this direction. And so these shifts that we just described, it becomes so frequent. It becomes so much the pattern. It becomes so intense. The intensity becomes so great that the shift becomes the drift. It's the changes that you see here become the direction that language is moving. Yes. What you're saying is that what you begin to see in terms of the instances of language, how language is being used, because that becomes so frequent, becomes so much the way we talk, it becomes the system of language. This is another dimension of the way of seeing language. The instances, these shifts that we saw just a moment ago, of this verb turned into this noun, this conjunction turned into this verb. They become such, it becomes a novel intensity, becomes something new. And that newness takes over until that shift becomes the drift. The instances become the system of language itself. But this is another reason why you need to do text linguistics. Do you see? Because what is the text? The text is the instance of language. So how do you know what is the language? Saussure talked about langue and parole, right? The instances are the parole, the way, the talking. The system of language is that language with a capital L, langue. But what is the system of language except the way we actually use language? So what has evolved, says Halliday, is the scaffolding for scientific knowledge is a dedicated semiotic system. A new way of talking. And we refer to that as a register of a language. What is a register? It is defined according to the use of language. What is a dialect? A dialect is defined according to the users. Where are they from? But a register is defined according to the use of language. This nominalizing grammar has given scientists enormous power over their environment, so much so that they can make the world stand still. Or as Halliday puts it, create new virtual realities. There's been a steady drift in the grammar of scientific discourses toward things. Yes. I mean, in many respects, what you see in what we just began looking at with Donald Jung, the whole idea, this ideology of things are in control. Things have been foregrounded at the expense of qualities, processes, and relations. So David Butt says this, Professor David Butt. For Halliday, there is a particular significance in probabilistic shifts in the lexicogrammatical system. When you say that it occurs with a novel intensity, it is something that occurs with a greater probability. You see, the whole point of when you say that the instances become the system, what you're just saying is that the system defines that this is the probability. This is the likely way you will speak. Now that's the language of science. Let's take a look at the language of verbal art. Now David Butt says this, and I don't expect you to understand this sentence yet, but hopefully you will. He says this, for Hassan, Professor Ruqaiya Hassan, it is the intervention of the writer in mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. Mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, taking the way that we actually use language and using it, though, with a non-habitual, unusual, unexpected consistency. All right, now, again, one of the books that I'd recommend to you. Another book that, and this book really, really influenced the way I do linguistics. And influenced me in a different direction too, because I have to be very honest with you. Up until I had read this book, I had no appreciation for poetry. To me, it seemed like, yes, nice words, but that's it. I didn't see the art in it. I didn't see the craft in it. It just seemed like the way one puts down words and so forth. And yeah, it can be beautiful, but I didn't really feel it. I didn't see it. I didn't see the art in it. I didn't see the craft. But when I read this book, looking at the way she looked at language, that impressed me, because I really began to see that there is an art to it. There is a technique to it. There's a craft to it. Now, Professor Ruqaiya Hasan, by the way, she's the wife of Professor M.A.K. Halliday. She was the wife of Professor M.A.K. Halliday. Both of them in recent years have passed away. Now, Professor Ruqaiya Hasan, whereas Professor Halliday was interested in the language of science, Professor Ruqaiya Hasan was interested in the language of verbal art. And in fact, both of them had gotten together in recent years. What they were going to be doing was they had sort of planned to do a book together, in which Halliday would take his observations about the language of science, and Professor Hasan would take her observations about the language of verbal art, and they would bring their ideas together to show how language, the metaphor-making power of language, really enables creativity and innovation. That what is happening in the language of science and what is happening in the language of verbal art both arise out of a unique ability that humans have to make metaphor. And this was their book project. Unfortunately, Professor Hasan passed away earlier than Professor Halliday. And so he asked Professor David Butt, I've referred to him several times, and me, to join with him to finish this book project, verbal art and verbal science. And so the three of us began working on this book project. And Professor Halliday recently passed away also. So now it's been left to Professor David Butt and myself. And so the topic itself is extremely important to me, looking at how language is being used and how linguistics, how looking at the language as a text gives us an insight into the nature of not just the language of science and the way we write for academic discourse, the way we write for the university, but also how the poets write poetry or the dramatists write their stories. Professor Hasan says that there are two orders of meaning. The first is the obvious. I mean, that is the way we're using language. You listening to me right now, that's the verbalization. You hear meaning, yes, you hear grammar, phonology, you hear me speaking, and I'm speaking grammatically, all right? And you hear what I'm saying, okay? Just like if you pick up a poem and you read it, and you see the words down on the page, and yes, they have a meaning. May tell a story, may describe something. That's one level of meaning. But what she's saying is that there is a way in which that first order of meaning becomes a second order of meaning, a deeper meaning. She says that it's accomplished through something she calls symbolic articulation. Now, I want you to unpack that. Symbolic. What are symbols? Symbols are metaphors. Articulation. You speak it out. You express it. So how does the metaphor, how is it produced? How is it made? Symbolic articulation, where the meanings of language are turned into signs having a deeper meaning. What is symbolic articulation? Symbolic articulation, in one sense at least, is achieved through foregrounding. It is exactly what Professor David Butt mentioned when I wrote it on an earlier slide. I said, mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. Now you see the picture that's there, right? You see this forest, trees. And what do you see? You see consistently it's trees. But then out of that consistent green, you see that line, that white line, which looks like a waterfall. Probably is a waterfall. But that waterfall stands out. It's striking. It's unlike anything else there in that picture. It's foregrounded. It's brought to the fore. It's brought to the front against a background of what's behind. And so what are you doing? You are taking the ways that we use language. You're mobilizing. You're taking the habitual patterns, the ways that we use language, and you are creating a background against which you will then foreground. You do this for a reason. You do this to create what Professor Hassan calls a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. She calls it theme. Now, this is not theme in the Hallidayan sense, all right? It isn't what occurs first in a clause. That's not what she means. What she means more is something more literary, all right? More like what you expect in literature. She came out of a background of literature, study of literature. So theme here is more in the literary sense. So you could say instead maybe the motif, okay? And so what you're doing is you are foregrounding is a kind of symbolic articulation in which you are creating in that piece of verbal art an extended metaphor that is expressing a hypothesis on the part of the writer, the poet, the dramatist, the novelist, about some aspect of the life of social man. That is its deeper meaning. That is the second order of meaning. She says this, theme is the message of an instance of verbal art. Again, I underscore theme as in a sense of motif. If, as a reader, one failed to get it, then the work has not been read so as to facilitate engagement in public discourse on verbal art. If you don't get it, if you don't, you're not really able to talk about this verbal art then. If, as a serious student of verbal art, one cannot engage in discourse and how the theme was symbolically articulated, if you cannot talk about how, and you cannot explain how that second order of meaning came about, how it was symbolically articulated from that first order of meaning, then one's assessment of the work will fall way below the standard required for teaching literature as an academic discipline. You cannot really be teaching literature if you cannot be dealing with what there is that created that second order of meaning, that theme, that motif, that hypothesis. But she goes on to say this does not necessarily mean that theme is what initially engages the reader. It's not necessarily what you notice when you first read that piece of poetry or you first hear that play. The theme is what's going to stay in your consciousness long after the pleasure of encountering the artistic turn of phrases had dissipated itself. In other words, the craft creates an art, and that art is going to create something that will stick with you. Even the most assiduous student of verbal art cannot retain the actual patterning of language patterns at the verbalization level of specific works. You won't remember the exact wording, but if the ideological message of the work has been spoken to the reader, who him or herself is obviously not ideologically innocent, then the theme impression will last. Has the ideological message spoken to you? Now you see, when someone writes poetry, or if there's a speech or something like that, the point is there more to what's being said there than immediately meets the eye. She continues, she says, having analyzed the symbolic articulation of theme in Shakespeare's As You Like It, one is not likely to forget the various guiding forces of equilibrium in human action, reflection, locution, which keep the material and social world sweetly rotating in peaceful harmony. In another paper, she writes this: there's widespread feeling that by adopting precise linguistic techniques and terminology for the analysis of literary language, one would be gaining a trivial accuracy without gaining any deeper insight in the nature of literature as a distinct kind of language activity. What she's saying is she's saying, and this is very often the case, people in literature look down on people in linguistics because they feel that what you're doing is trivial. You're looking for all these patterns and everything like this. Yes, you may collect all these calculations and tables and so forth, but it's trivial. Now, she agrees to a certain extent. She said this has been strengthened by recent trends in stylistics, where linguists often equated style with frequency tables and cited ungrammaticality as an associated feature of some genres of literary register. In other words, yeah, if you just do your tables of statistics, and if you keep saying, oh yes, notice how that's ungrammatical, then yeah, it is a kind of trivial pursuit. Now, someone else commenting about Ruqaiya Hasan's approach said this, though, Lance St. John Butler. Ruqaiya Hasan, perhaps the strongest Hallidayan of them all, has devoted some time to the topic of the specifically literary. In her paper, The Place of Stylistics in the Study of Verbal Art, and her book, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art, she makes an intriguing compromise between the linguistic gospel of Halliday and the special concessions needed to deal with the phenomenon of literature. Hasan's work is a good first step towards the sort of liberation we need. She is aware that a linguistic analysis of a text, stylistics in action, is a vast undertaking. Even as simple a sentence as Robert Frost's, "I wonder about the trees," needs exhaustive analysis at the levels of semantics, syntax, lexicon, phonology. And she imagines the innumerable tables listing frequencies of tokens of different types from the various levels of language. But she rejects this method. And she objects that without any hypothesis, one can do very little with such tables. How could one form an interpretation from them? Straight linguistic analysis can say nothing about the text as art. Yes, it's not just, once you got your tables, once you got your data, that's not all there is to it. And that's why I said to you at the beginning that this course is not just about, yes, it's about the analysis, it's about getting the data, but once you got the data, it's another step. And what she's saying is that you have to have a hypothesis about what is that poet's hypothesis. What is theme? Theme is your hypothesis about the hypothesis being put forward. What is the deeper meaning? You have to have a sense that, in fact, yes, there is. What is that deeper meaning? What is it that's being said? What is the theme? And the hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man, that hypothesis of the poet becomes your hypothesis about what that poet means. You have to have a hypothesis, and what does that hypothesis then say? The hypothesis then must be substantiated by your evidence, and your evidence is your linguistic analysis. It's like any science. You begin with a hypothesis and need to prove that hypothesis. And what your hypothesis is as the analyst, as the linguist, is to say, what was the hypothesis being put forward by that poet, that dramatist, that novelist? What was their meaning? There is a meaning, and I am trying to identify that meaning through their use of language. The patterns of language are so deployed as to take us in a particular direction. Each message is a message by itself, but the totality of these messages enunciates a theme. Looking at the patterns of language, there's a theme there. And the theme becomes accessible by the examination of the meaning of those individual messages, the clauses, and guided by the repatterning of patterns, the patterns that emerge out of it, mobilizing the habitual patterns of language use into a inconsistent. The words of a poem are used in a symbolic way, having more than a single meaning. The effect of a few simple words combined in a particular way is to evoke a sense of reality none of them possess alone. The nature of this reality is not precise, it is indefinite. It is not just about the words, it is also about the wordings. I'm going to stop here. There's a lot more that I want to cover, and we'll do it next week. I will really explain to you what it means to mobilize the habitual patterns of language choice into a non-habitual consistency. What does that mean? And we're going to see a patterning in that. We're going to see how that emerges in the poetry and enables us to see the poetry and how it makes meaning. Okay, so see you next week. We'll stop there. Okay, don't forget, if you didn't do the survey yet, do the survey about your preferences going forward. All right? Okay, bye-bye.